What if every prop in Portal 2 was like a giant fridge magnet, getting pulled to the nearest wall and sticking to it unless pulled away? Immediately, this brings up a few questions, like how do you keep cubes on buttons? Well, by default, I made it so that buttons cancel out the magnets, which makes things more fair if you're just looking to have fun. I'm in it for the challenge though, so I'll be playing on the hard difficulty wherever possible, which means that I don't get this privilege. Instead, my solution for the first chamber involved exploiting the grab-release cooldown to get the cube stuck on the edge of the button while I'm walking backwards, which gives me just barely enough time to reach the exit door. Yeah, this is quite literally the very first puzzle of the game, and it's already far from simple. In fact, this second map is already physically impossible on the hard difficulty. The exit door is sealed off from the button, so I couldn't just do what I did on the last map, which meant that I had to switch to easy mode in order to at all beat the chamber. There are of course equally many nothing burger maps, like this one, where all you really do is get the portal gun. Since this mod only affects physics props like cubes, cameras, and turrets, I was able to do this one just fine. If you try to shoot a portal under the cube, what'll happen is it'll actually move away from the portal because it's trying to gravitate towards the closest wall, right? And if you remove the wall behind the cube, it'll go to whichever, wall is the closest next. On this map, the gap between the wall and the button is ever so slightly too wide for the cube to stay in place, which is why I had to pull this camera off the wall to create a kind of padding for closing that gap. This will become a very common strategy later on. The second room has two buttons right in the middle, which makes the intended solution impossible. As you might already know, however, clipping a cube through the door activates an anti-soft lock trigger, which forces the door open without actually having to solve the puzzle. One important thing to note is that props are only attracted to walls, not floors or ceilings, which becomes a problem once you need a cube to fall through a floor portal. My solution here was to do a portal stand, which lets me get onto this platform and take the cube through by myself. I can then set up the same trick I used on the first puzzle, since the exit door is right next to its button. There's a similar route for the next map, as you can't get the cube out of this cage, so the next best thing is to get inside the cage yourself. The radius of this placement helper extends past the glass wall just barely, making it possible to shoot a portal inside it from the orange portal. From here, you can grab the cube, get it stuck on the button, the usual. What's not the same as usual is the second room. The cube dropper is really far off the ground, which by extension means the cube lands far off the ground too. It's just barely out of reach from a fling. I tried various ideas, but what ended up working was unmounting this camera and jumping off of it mid-fling. The rest of the puzzle after that is fairly self-explanatory. Oh, and fun fact, Wheatley is also affected by this, though that's not really much of a problem, as he spends most of the time either mounted on a rail or carried in the player's hands. Instead, the main fear I had going into this challenge came from laser maps, where you need cubes to stay in place after being lined up. This isn't really a problem on easy mode, but on the difficulty I was playing, I obviously couldn't just leave the cube in the middle of the room. Once again, the wall-mounted camera came to rescue. You can get the cube to lean against it in a way that angles it perfectly into the receptor. I could have also done the speedrun route on this map, but let's face it, that would have been much more boring. And yeah, the same goes for the next map. I could have easily done the laser switch glitch here and be done with it in seconds, but I had another much more interesting idea in mind. It took some time to get right, we're talking close to 20 minutes, but by tilting the cube downwards from this wall, I could activate the laser receptor from the side. That's so cool though. Okay, and now we can pretty much do the intended solution. I mean, I say intended, but this is about as intended as it gets. Okay, what can we do here? That's not where I expected it to go. At this point, I'd already kind of established that I'm going to be trying to look for the coolest solution wherever possible, instead of the easiest one. And on this map, that meant getting to the exit without using the laser. I used the cube to build a kind of staircase to climb up to the observatory room window, from which I could then pretty easily reach the exit. Catapult intro, the next map on the list, is usually not much of a problem in these challenges. However, just like in Future Starter, the cube dropper is way up above floor level. This was entirely a 50-50. If it went to the left, it would land on a portable surface and I could reach it no problem. If it went to the right, I'd have to get creative. I got lucky. This meant that all I had to do was get one of the cameras, stand on it to get on top of the door frame, and use the wall there to shoot a portal from which to get the cube. Let's see what happens to these. I think I already know. I just want to know which wall is closest. Okay, it's that one. Honestly, not so bad. Where's the cube gonna go? Okay, it's there. That looks surprisingly achievable, because if I just do this, I can grab it? Yeah, okay. And to fill the gap between the button and the wall, I just brought back the turret that the dropper dispenses as one of its first initial pieces of garbage. By now, you'll probably have noticed that props only start to get magnetized as soon as they leave their respective dropper. And while that works just fine on most maps, it's actually kind of a problem here on Pitflings. There's a soft lock prevention system here that drops a new cube if you accidentally leave it out of reach. And since in our case the cube is never within reach to begin with, this leads to an infinite loop. That's fine though, I'm a speedrunner, I can just do a super reportal to get up there and break the cycle. But if you're planning on playing this yourself, you might have to get creative, even on easy mode. And yeah, in case you didn't know, you can play almost any mod I make for free. The link for that will be in the description. And while you're down there, I'd also appreciate if you subscribed and considered becoming a channel member. I can't even begin to explain how much that would mean to me. Anyway, back to the chamber. There's still one unsolved problem. How do we pad the gap near the button? There are no cameras to unmount here, but you can pick up Wheatley while he briefly peeks behind a panel in the wall. He's a fully solid physics prop, which means I can use him to hold down the cube for me. At least he's useful for something. This is Ceiling Catapult, and I'd actually thought of a pretty cool route for this puzzle in advance, which involved pointing the laser cube downwards to get it to reach a portable surface. I ended up not needing that. Huh. I didn't expect that to work. I was going to have a fate like pointing downwards, but this also works. The next map is also in theory a laser puzzle, though I pretty much ignored that aspect of it entirely by doing the speedrun route instead to launch up to the exit platform. On the easy difficulty, I'd already be done here, but I still needed something to pad the gap for the button. There's really only one other prop in this map, and that's the second cube. Since I need both cubes to fling up here, the idea was instead to cube hop along the left wall to reach the platform without using faith blades. You'd think prop hopping like this would be trivial given the circumstances, but it's actually much worse than in the vanilla game, because the props are completely unstable while magnetized. I actually had to try prop climbing with a camera on the next map, which was even worse. The cube dropper is once again very high up, and there's really no easy way to get there. I was almost ready to give up here. Until... Wait! What the... You can grab it! And with the plot armor fully deployed, I was able to grab the cube through the glass and bring it low enough to reach with the bridge. And I haven't even mentioned the main benefit we get from bridges. If the button is out in the open, you can use the bridge to hold down the cube, which is just so much simpler than everything else I was doing before. It doesn't work everywhere, but when it does, it's an incredibly satisfying solution. Oh, turret intro. Beautiful. Beautiful. Yeah, so some of them are still alive, actually. Tippy died. That's unfortunate. Obviously, this mod affects turrets just the same. It's kind of funny walking through the chamber, seeing them all glued to a wall, but, you know, to their credit, they're still scanning. There's one map in particular that was an absolute nightmare to do on hard, and that's this one. The gap between the button and the nearest wall is uncomfortably large here. But I do have 3 turrets and a camera to stuff it with. It's just that once you have this many props in one place, the whole setup gets incredibly unstable. Stay, 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 stay. Good cube, good cube. Oh, that is horrible. I make it look quick in the edits, but this whole thing took nearly half an hour. It's really quite unfortunate to have spent this much time trying to beat that map on the hard difficulty, as upon entering the next one, I immediately diagnosed it as impossible. The gap between the wall and the button is simply way too large, and there's nothing you can really use to pad it. Sure, there's a stash of mugs and whatnot in the Ratman den, but none of those have collision with other physics objects. Switching the difficulty didn't even make it that much easier. I still had to block the laser somehow. Though, for that, I came up with a contraption that involved sandwiching a camera between 2 bridges so that I could unblock it by shooting a portal from the exit platform. Similarly, the next map is also obviously impossible on hard, but I decided to give it a shot nonetheless to see how far I can get. Problem number one is these cubes. They don't drop far enough to reach the faith plates, so there's no easy way to get them. I did a couple of flurry portals to get enough height to reach the first cube, but the second one wasn't going to be so easy. There's a large clip brush here surrounding the platform, and while it doesn't affect the cube, it does prevent the player from getting near it. Since I already had one cube, I could use it to create a platform for getting the other one. Then, a bit of uncomfortable parkour later, I was able to finish the recon mission with both cubes safely retrieved. Though from here things do actually get impossible, as you need at least one of the cubes to be sitting out in the open. Toggling easy mode makes powered laser cubes stay in place, so that's what I did for this one. Alright, if you thought all of that was hard, you'll have to strap yourself in for laser chaining. As the name suggests, the solution to this puzzle is to chain several laser cubes across long gaps in order to activate all of the relays. If I were playing on easy mode, this would be no problem. But on the hard difficulty, setting up these precise lineups while the cubes are being actively torn away from their positions is a cruel nightmare. First, I tried simply jamming the cube with all sorts of garbage to keep it in place, which, while unstable, did work for activating one of the relays. But the resulting laser angle made it impossible to set up another cube for the second relay. Another idea I had was to clip the laser through the wall and try to do the puzzle in reverse. In Portal 2, laser redirection cubes project their lasers a few inches outside of the cube, which makes it possible for the laser to leave the chamber if placed close enough to a wall. Unfortunately, in this specific case, the brush structure of the map didn't allow the laser to re-enter the chamber, so this approach was utterly useless. I also tried having the laser cube point upwards in hopes that I could use the portal surface on the ceiling to solve the map, but then I'd have no way of making it to the exit. The solution that did finally work was a variant of the first strategy. I created a sort of laser triangle to straighten out the beam. This was cutting it close, and the margin of error was thin, but the straighter beam meant that I could use the classic cube and camera trick to hit both relays at the same time. Yes! Oh my god! I just dropped it. I just dropped it and that worked. Okay. We were on that map for 47 minutes. I was very happy to leave. Triple Laser had the potential to be much worse, but I wasn't going to torture myself with the intended route here, at least not after all that. So this meant that we were coming up on the escape sequence, which served as a well-deserved break for all that came before it. This part of the game has hardly any physics props, especially when it comes to ones that you need to interact with. Without a test chamber, there's no cubes or anything. The props that do exist here are mostly used for scripted sequences, and once the mod starts messing with those, things fall apart real quick. In turret sabotage, I didn't actually have to sabotage the turrets, just taking the template out was enough, as the defective ones were pulled close enough to the wall to hit the trigger. And the neurotoxin sabotage sequence was also broken, but this time not in a good way. The panels that get sliced in half got stuck in place and blocked the laser from going through the portal. I tried pushing them away, but they don't have collision with the player, so the next best thing was to perform implosion skip, completely avoiding the need for cutting the pipes in the first place. I'm not an active speedrunner, so it took me about an hour to get this trick. Heading into Chapter 6, we're finally placed back into the test chambers, though this time with ever so slightly different proportions. There are no wall-mounted cameras here, and generally this section of the game doesn't give you any more physics props than are necessary, which makes bridging this gap to the button, well, frankly impossible. I came up with a different solution though. Unlike the modern test chamber doors, these ones don't have invisible blockers in them. I could jam the door with the cube and use the collision gap that creates to get through the door. And in the second room, the button for the flip panel was actually wide enough that, for the first time in this playthrough, I didn't need a second prop to hold it in place. This part of the game also introduces gel, which I haven't talked about yet. Unfortunately, there's really not that much to discuss here. Gel simply isn't affected. If it were, pretty much every single gel-focused map would be impossible. Though this also meant that I had no remorse for skipping puzzles which only had gel with no props. The Crazy Box Chamber is a bit different in this regard, as there is one prop, and it's quite problematic at that, mostly because the button for it is in the middle of the room. I tried a bunch of things, but they made effectively no progress. So in the end, I settled on just turning on easy mode and toggling it off once I got on the elevator. These last couple of chapters were a mix of trivially easy maps sandwiched between puzzles which are impossible on hard. Prop Flings is another one of those. To start off, the cube that drops at the start of the chamber immediately starts flying off of its platform towards the dome, from where it slowly slides down into the goo. This is still fine though, as once it drowns, I get to catch it after it respawns. But as I said, this puzzle is still impossible on the hard difficulty, because the button is too far from any wall. Now, technically, I could have done the speedrun route and not had to switch difficulties, but that kind of feels like a cop-out. Following another set of chambers with unlimited gel but no props, we're brought to Chapter 8, the introduction of Frankencubes. I knew this door is special in the sense that it doesn't have a physics blocker, which meant that I could get a cube stuck inside while it's closing. Unfortunately, there is a player blocker, so the 20 or so minutes I spent here were all for nothing. I had to toggle easy mode. Wheatley's chamber could have been equally problematic if it weren't for this invisible wall that made sure the cube falls straight onto the button. Since this isn't an actual wall, the cube doesn't get stuck to it, so I can wait for it to slide down while hugging the door. Another thing this chapter introduces is the excursion funnel. I was really hoping that the funnel would overpower the magnets, but it turned out to be the other way around. Funnels were practically useless when it came to managing props. On this chamber especially, I needed the cube to stay on the ceiling mounted button, which you would typically do with a funnel. Instead, I ended up not using the funnel at all. My solution was to place the cube near a wall in a way that it would slowly slide down into a portal while I got to the exit. The other portal is then placed near the button in a way that makes the cube roll over it to reach the nearest wall. If I hug the exit door while this happens, I can just barely make it through. Of course, I myself can still ride the funnels just fine, so as long as I'm holding on to the cube, it won't go anywhere. And this map also marks the second ever time that I don't need a spacer prop, and it's on a ceiling button at that. When programming the behavior where cubes don't magnetize until they're outside of a dropper, I wanted to optimize the routine and made the assumption that droppers are completely static elements and will never move. However, it seems I forgot about one map where that's not the case. Yes, the cube was stuck, and I could have gone back and changed the code, but I decided to try pulling it out myself. I'd been avoiding the crouch fly glitch up until now, but this seemed like a good use for it. I slowly and carefully flew up into the dropper, grabbed the cube, disabled the fly glitch, and then landed in the funnel that I had placed below me. The next couple of maps weren't particularly challenging. There were only a few moments where I had to pull some tricks to work around the magnets, and I was hoping that Stop the Box would be similar in that sense. But no, actually, this was probably the hardest one yet. It all stems from the fact that this cube doesn't reach the Faith Blade before it gets pulled to the wall. I can't really grab it from below either, it's just much too far back. If you're planning on playing this mod casually, I suggest you just skip this map, as the solution I came up with is pretty damn awful. First, you exploit a gap in this broken window model to shoot a portal into the observatory room. Then, you set up your portals to perform an FCPS clip. FCPS stands for Find Closest Passable Space. It's the algorithm which decides what to do when the player is stuck inside of a solid. Depending on how you're moving when it kicks in, it can sometimes teleport you through walls. This got me on the outer frame of the window from where I did this jump. At this point, you could use the cube to set up PPD. That's where you rotate your collision shadow to clip through the exit door. But I wasn't going to test my patience any further and decided to just toggle easy mode for the button. We're approaching the end of the game, and from here onward, the mod was actually kind of beneficial to me in the sense that it cleared away turrets on some of the maps. All in all though, the lead up to the finale is eerily quiet, with not many effective props getting in the way. And alas, upon reaching Wheatley's lair, the final boss was tremendously underwhelming. His bombs aren't affected, as that would break the sequence. And sure, the cores are magnetized, but as long as you keep a grip on them at all times, this isn't really a problem. So that's it. If you liked what you saw, you can subscribe to the channel or even become a channel member. If you do, your name will appear at the end of videos, kind of like this, and you'll get exclusive pre-releases of mods, sneak peeks of upcoming content, and so on. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.